Welcome to this explainer on the architecture of calculated exhaustion. So let's just dive right into this. If you have ever felt completely drained, just totally exhausted after a few minutes of scrolling on your phone, well, I'm here to tell you that it is absolutely not an accident. It's actually a highly calculated design. Today, we're going to look at the deep, invisible systems running just beneath the glass of our screens.
Consider this quote from our source material. Your brain did not design your attention span to fail. It was systematically targeted. Really think about that for a second. This framework explains how modern digital interfaces are built to intentionally exploit a very primitive evolutionary glitch in human beings. See, our brains are hardwired for survival, right? Which means we have this primal instinct to constantly scan our environment for sudden changes. And digital platforms completely hijack this exact survival mechanism, literally weaponizing our own evolutionary biology against us.
This hijacking is driven by something we call cognitive friction. By flooding your perception with infinite, completely unpredictable micro-rewards, things like push notifications, likes, or just an endless stream of short videos, the algorithm purposefully induces continuous cognitive friction. When an interface constantly demands your attention with these little micro-rewards, it drains your mental reserves so fast. You don't just get distracted, you become highly suggestion-prone. You actually begin to lose the cognitive sovereignty required to choose what you care about, effectively becoming a passive observer inside your own life.
To really understand how we got here, we actually have to rewind to a pivotal moment in scientific history. The year is 1954. This is when the famous behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner engineered an environment that would, completely unknowingly at the time, lay the groundwork for modern digital behavior. He built what's known in psychology as the conditioning chamber.
Picture this, a stark, concrete cube. Inside this isolated chamber was a singular, extremely clinical focal point, a heavy, mechanical brass lever. This was an interface of pure cause and effect. Skinner designed it to test how an animal's behavior could be shaped by rewards, and this mid-century experiment actually grounds our entire understanding of modern digital algorithms in a very physical, clinical reality.
So the crucial point here is the behavioral difference between two very specific scenarios. At first, Skinner set up a predictable reward. When the lab animal pressed the lever, it received a food drop every single time. And the result? The animal's behavior was fixed, it was calm, and it was entirely logical. It only pressed the lever when it was actually hungry. But then, Skinner changed the parameters to a variable reward. He randomized it. Now the lever dropped food entirely by chance. Half the time, it did absolutely nothing. Once those reward parameters were randomized, the lab animal's behavior shifted dramatically. It went from logical to entirely obsessive and frantic, striking the handle over and over again.
And that perfectly illustrates the mechanics of the variable reward. It's a randomized outcome that transforms anticipation into an intense survival signal. This unpredictability floods the brain with dopamine. But here's the really critical part. That massive dopamine rush, it doesn't actually come from the satisfaction of getting the reward. It comes from the primitive terror of anticipation. The subject gets trapped in a state of permanent compulsion simply because they cannot predict the outcome. Now, I want you to think about the physical gesture of pulling down on your screen to refresh a social media feed. It is the exact same mechanism as the lab animal pressing that brass lever in the 1950s. You don't scroll because you're finding immense value every single time. You scroll because your neurochemistry cannot resist the primitive terror of missing what comes next. The harsh reality of platform monetization is that they don't actually want you to arrive at a destination. Finding what you're looking for and putting your phone away, that is terrible for business. Instead, the state of endless searching is the ultimate goal. Being trapped in that permanent compulsion, endlessly pulling the digital lever in search of a variable reward, that is exactly what keeps the engine running. Section: the neurological engine, prefrontal glucose drain. We've seen the digital lever, but now we really need to look at the literal biological cost this exacts on your brain. Let's focus on your prefrontal cortex. It sits right behind your forehead and acts as your biological command center for logic, willpower, and executive decision-making. But unlike the rest of your body, this command center runs on a highly volatile, finite fuel source, physical glucose. It is not an infinite battery. Every single time you make a choice, exercise willpower, or process complex information, you are actively draining this physical reservoir of glucose. Now, let's apply that biological limit to the digital world. When you browse an infinite feed, your brain isn't just passively watching. It's forced to execute an industrial scale of rapid calculations every single second. Evaluate the image. Register the text. Ignore the distraction. Click. Over and over and over at lightning speed. This simulates massive cognitive overload, and it drains that physical glucose at a terrifying rate. And eventually, you hit a clinical breaking point, which is known as neurochemical bankruptcy. After extended periods of navigating these fast-paced, highly stimulating interfaces, your executive control engine essentially shatters. It runs completely out of fuel. You have absolutely no more physical glucose left in the prefrontal cortex to make logical, willful decisions. Which brings us to the core of the architecture we're talking about today: calculated exhaustion. This is a state where an algorithm has intentionally depleted your prefrontal energy to destroy your ability to say no. The crucial takeaway here is that this exhaustion isn't an accidental byproduct of bad design. It is the intended metric. The algorithms are purposely built to run you out of fuel so that your logical barriers completely fall away. When that prefrontal glucose is spent and those logical barriers fall, the behavioral fallout is severe. Your impulse regulation completely fails. Your ability to manage anxiety drops. Your long-term focus breaks entirely. As a result, your mind drops back into a primitive evolutionary defense track. You aren't actively navigating your life anymore. You suffer a complete reversion to automated consumption, literally just consuming whatever the algorithm funnels into your field of vision. You become a ghost inside your own anatomy. It's a chilling reality, isn't it? When you reach this state of calculated exhaustion, your biological focus is no longer your own. It is effectively being puppeteered by a third-party developer's script. You are physically present, sure, but your executive function is entirely offline. But, understanding this architecture is actually super empowering. The ultimate prize for these platforms was never just your demographic data, your buying patterns, or your search history. No, the true target was your mental sovereignty, your very ability to focus and choose for yourself. Knowing that completely changes how we view our interaction with these platforms. So, now that you can see the invisible architecture and you understand the very real biological cost of the digital lever, what is your next move? Because the moment you recognize the design, the power dynamic completely shifts. Will you remain a passive observer, just letting the algorithm drain your cognitive fuel? Or will awareness become your primary defense the next time you reach for the screen? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.